Welcome as we wrap up this masterclass in SEL, socio-emotional learning, as we talk about some of the different factors and aspects of what it is to learn holistically. As we start this conversation, I think it's important to note that many of us come into every conversation with confirmation bias. If you look at the work of Tversky and Kahneman, if you've read Nudge or Thinking Fast and Slow, then you know that most people consider themselves to be better than average at just about anything they put time against. Most people who drive think that they're a better than average driver. Most parents think that they are a better than average parent. Most teachers think that they're a better than average teacher. Obviously, if you're looking at actual averages, that can't possibly be true. But it's also important to note that as a result of that, we often ignore information we might not want to ignore. We think we know things that we don't actually know. We think we practice in ways we don't actually practice. That's why these sorts of experiences are so powerful and so important. Now, I understand that professional development also has some confirmation biases that go with it. You may have had some weak professional development experiences in your career. I certainly have in mine. We're going to try really, really hard to make this practical so that it's not fuzzy, it's not nebulous. That's what we're going to attempt to do today.
I think that's a really good place for us to start, Jeff, because we've talked about it earlier in this masterclass, this idea that social emotional learning, the idea of all of this kind of realm of conation or affection is very different from the way that we think about cognitive studies and the way that we think about education with those really clear practical strategies to increase scores that we can track really easily. Social emotional learning is a bit different from that. Sometimes I think we can feel like it's a bit fuzzy, and when we don't really have a clear idea of strategies, we can get stuck and not know how to proceed. So how do we make sure that it is practical? David, you are such an expert in this. I'm curious what your experiences have been around making this a not fuzzy subject.
Well, I think the absolute best way to approach it is through outcomes. As part of the master course that you took, we examined some of the research that underpins a lot of best practices in social emotional learning and how they impact learners specifically. We know that when we address most of the affective domains for learners, they thrive in classrooms, but more importantly, the instructors, the teachers that support that learning thrive too. But it's not just about what you're doing in the classroom, it's about the things that you're doing in your own personal life and the habits you develop as part of this. I think more than anything, that's what causes some frustration for some educators, because it's not a series of things that I do in the classroom. It's a way of believing in the things that you're doing and fostering beliefs in the students who are doing those things too. So I think to help clarify it all, adding in some framework that helps outline really what social emotional learning is, what those practices are, that goes a long way towards creating an easier, more visible pathway towards SEL, especially SEL practices that do yield those positive impacts for everybody involved in their learning.
You know, we've now revisited the concept of affection a few times, and you heard Cassie refer to conation. Let's just remind ourselves of what we talked about in the very first conversation we had in this course, that cognition is largely what we have spent most of our time worrying about, measuring, treating in K through 20 education. But we know that you're really ignoring about 2/3 of student needs when you do that in terms of learning. Not just in terms of community, not just in terms of friendships and relationships, but actually in terms of what people need to learn. Affection really does speak to how satisfied a person is, how networked they are, how supported they feel. And conation brings up grit and mindset and basically volition. If a person believes they can, they can. And for many people, if they believe they cannot, then they cannot. So as we talk about these issues, these differences really become important as we think about our students.
I think this becomes so important too, to remind ourselves of the learning triangle or the stool and how this just really is universal around all kinds of learning. We talked a little bit earlier in this masterclass around this idea of social emotional learning. We're seeing it resonate really strongly in K-12. We're seeing it work its way into higher ed as well, but sometimes we see some differences there. And I think we should call out. It's not a difference in the fact that social emotional learning is important. It's important whether you're teaching with pedagogy or andragogy. It's just how you approach it. So Jeff and David, you come from higher ed and K-12 backgrounds. What are your pieces of advice for how we start to bring this into our classrooms, regardless of what grade or age level we're teaching?
Let me jump in really quickly, and then we'll hear from our expert in David. This absolutely is an issue in higher education. We call it different things. So while we don't really use SEL, you don't hear that in a higher ed perspective. We do know that students struggle if they don't feel connected to an institution. I think about Texas Christian University and how they have a center that is all about connectedness based on the work of Michael Stollard and some other folks. That is all about affection and conation coming into play. And we know that if higher ed students walk into a classroom without those feelings, that again, we're risking losing those students in terms of their ability to learn. So I'll try to translate some of this into higher ed speak if I have to, but I know David spent a lot of time in really the K through 20 world as well. So David, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that if you had a chance to watch the social emotional learning webinar that we did a little bit earlier in the year, we had an educator there who shared a story about how she relates social emotional learning to the educators that she trains to actually put these practices into, or put these theories into practice. She likens it to wearing masks, which I think is extremely relevant given the time that we're in. But she essentially drew a parallel between a teacher having to save students from a fire, and then how that teacher, through their own behaviors, will ultimately dictate the safety of students. The long or the short way around this, from a very long anecdote, is that when teachers are not looking after themselves, they're unable to look after others. So the first work that teachers need to do in any profession, at any grade level, in any dynamic in education, is to address their own personal social emotional learning needs first. This can take any number of different forms, whether this is engaging in daily mindfulness exercises, whether it's trying to establish relationships with other educators to build a community of support for those practices within your educational organization. The steps the teacher takes to address their own basic needs is going to be that very, very critical first step. And research shows that when educators do this, when they take a more proactive approach to their own social emotional well-being, they significantly grow in their capacity for social emotional learning practices in their personal life, but also in their ability to communicate those practices to learners in the classroom. This is extraordinarily impactful because we often talk about the need for teachers to be supported, the need for educators to feel supported in the education of their learners, but this can extend to every aspect of a learner's dynamic. So it's not just social emotional practices for the teacher at school, it's also the things that mom and dad can do to support social emotional learning in the household. And then ultimately what the student will do to help foster social emotional learning gains with their own peer groups and in other relationships that they have in their life. One of the most interesting effects of social emotional learning practice development that I've seen manifest in the teachers that I've worked with is the student learner becoming the primary advocate for social emotional learning needs. I remember a teacher talking to a student at one point about frustrations over a quiz. At one point, the student stopped, self-advocated, and said, I need a couple moments to breathe. That's a wonderful thing to hear, but that's not built in a day. That's built through a culture of understanding of the benefits of doing these sorts of things, and then fostering those in relationships between the learners as you build sort of a culture of practice around social emotional learning.
I really love that framing, David, that you gave us around how this isn't built in a day. So I'm not going to see the impacts on my own self or on my learners immediately, but that doesn't mean that this isn't making my life better to bring social emotional learning into my classroom. Ultimately, that's what it's doing. It's not taking away from the academics. It's not competing at all with the academic work I'm trying to do in the classroom. it's enabling my learners to be able to use those skills like self-awareness or self-management or resilience or responsible decision-making, and actually use that to support their academics. But it has to be taught explicitly. And I think that really is true regardless of what age level I'm teaching, all the way from kindergarten to my university or college students. I still need to explicitly support social emotional learning and then connect that to the work that I'm doing. You gave some practical examples there. I'm curious, do you have any suggestions for people who are just getting started with this, where they would start with practical solutions for their classroom?
Yeah, so I've invested a large amount of time training teachers, but also training myself, working on my own social emotional learning and development. If you ask any person who's really ingrained in social emotional learning, one of the first things that we talk about is grounding, and how grounding exercises are so critical to building the foundation for good, more complex social emotional learning interactions later. Grounding exercises are very simple. They allow you to step outside of all of the noise, all the frustrations, all the things that are complicating your day, and rooting you in the here and now. Understanding in that moment that you're okay, that in this one moment, you can control the things that are most important to you and that are critical to your basic needs. Those are the things that matter most. So often stopping to have students take a breath before taking a test can do wonders for them. Focusing on breathing is a very elemental thing. It's something we all rely on. It's also very grounding. There's no wrong way to do it. So having just the presence and mindset of taking a pause, feel the wind on your face, feel the ground beneath your feet, take a breath and focus on the air moving. These are very simple, basic things, but they build a very, very solid foundation for more complex interactions later.
You know, that reminds me of just some of the neuroscience research that I've seen that shows simple things like getting up and taking a 3-minute walk before you do something that requires, cognitive ability. It changes how your entire brain works in that moment. And we can actually now tie these things back to brain science, which we talked about in the very first asset here in this masterclass. These gaps that we're dealing with are significant in K through 20 education. So I'm so glad that we were able to bring you in. I hope that at the same time, some of our participants might use this masterclass as a way to start to find and connect with some other people. But we really want to thank everybody for joining us in this conversation, in this experience. But really, Cassie and I want to thank you, David, for your expertise, for sharing it with us. It has been really wonderful to learn from you. And we hope we'll see you again in another masterclass.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really thoroughly enjoyed our conversations. I think all of the work that's being done, whether it's being done on social emotional learning, whether it's being done on growth mindset, these are the sorts of things that are going to make the greatest impact, especially after a really tumultuous year and a half of teacher work. The efforts that we put into social emotional learning now, we know through research are going to be extraordinarily beneficial, and it starts with very simple, basic steps. So just focusing on those few basic things that you can do to get started, and then starting to build those communities of practice around SEL. Those are going to give you a huge advantage moving forward. And of course, we would love to be a part of that down the road. So don't forget about us. We are constantly working on building our capacity to help those who are using our systems to do so in responsible ways. And we welcome all the feedback we can get. So thank you for making me a part of these discussions, Jeff and Cassie. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So for the end of this particular masterclass, thanks for coming. Good luck and good learning.